Well, like you said, there was an initial investment in the mapping in the 1970s, and then there was a real lull between 1980 and the early 2000s. There was an assumption that once we mapped it, we wouldn't really need to map it again, and the funding was very low, so FEMA was having a hard time keeping up with the maps. So not only was it unable to map new areas during this time, but it was unable to update the very old maps that quickly sort of became outdated. So the funding did go up in the 2000s. It was recognized that the maps were critical, but like I said, there's such a backlog, right? This is a problem if you neglect policies that there was a lot to do. And so they used a lot of that initial funding in the 2000s to simply digitize the maps. So these were actually making digital copies of old paper maps that were based on outdated studies. What they weren't able to invest enough in is actual new engineering studies at the local level to remap the flood risk in communities that had, in some cases pretty radically changed in terms of the amount of their development and therefore the flood risk associated with it. So as someone I talked to said, they are neglecting the cornfields and cow pastures, the places where on the edge of development that are probably going to see development in the future. And oftentimes those places are completely unmapped. So what this means is that communities can start developing in these areas, not knowing perhaps that they're in a flood zone.
Are we taking into account anything about like climate change or rising sea levels or hotter than average temperatures or are we looking at any of that kind of stuff? Because I got to be honest with you, a huge portion of the planet is water. It's not going anywhere. It's just going to keep going onto land. Are we doing anything about that, or do we even care?
I think some people care. We're not doing enough about it, in my opinion. And this is one of the things I'm studying is adapting to climate change. And these maps are very important for us to be able to do that. I would say that we're not doing that right now. FEMA's aware of this. They've started a new program that tries to have a more dynamic set of maps that can map future flood risks, but these are for informational purposes only, and local communities have to request them from FEMA. But it's non-regulatory. So it does not, in other words, it doesn't have any regulatory impact unless the local communities decide to use it to plan development in their floodplains and change building regulations in floodplains. So it is up to the local community to decide whether they want to use those risk maps or not. Some won't even probably request them. So the maps that we've been using and we continue to use for regulatory purposes, that is for the purposes of buying insurance, flood insurance, and also for the purposes of minimum regulations, floodplain regulations, are backward and static. So they are backward looking. They're based on historical data. They are static, so they are not looking to the future. So to the extent that any studies can pick up some of those early changes having to do with sea level rise and precipitation patterns, then the maps will slowly start to reflect that if we update them frequently, right? So that's a sort of a big if. They will capture, sort of past events, but they will not capture future events unless we start using, putting that into maps for actual regulatory purposes.
This strikes me. So basically what you're saying is, if I'm hearing you correctly, if you're taking historical data, you're trying to predict what's going to happen based on history.
Yes.
If you take future-looking data, you're trying to predict what you think is going to happen in the future. I think that sounded very redundant, but necessary. So we're trying to predict a lot of things here when it comes to the issue of flooding and natural disasters. And for the purposes of this conversation that you and I are having, we get it right a lot and we get it wrong a lot, I think. If someone says I'm in the 100-year floodplain and I don't flood for the last 300 years, why am I in the 100-year floodplain? Or take a city like Houston, Texas. Hurricane Harvey just demolished Houston. Houston has been flooding basically every year since the 1800s, since it was founded. Why? Because Houston's a swamp. And so, but we keep doing this thing with Houston. So, and here's the deal with Houston. 20% of Houstonians have flood insurance, 80% don't. How is that even possible from a historical perspective? Then looking towards the future, what you're talking about, trying to predict climate change, trying to predict where these storms are going to hit, shrinking beaches in Florida, shrinking communities, etc., shrinking islands off the coast of Maryland and Virginia and elsewhere, and in the Caribbean where we own some territories. That seems to me that's just as unpredictable as whether or not history is predictable. How do we know these things?
Well, I think you've raised a number of really important questions. Now a flood like Harvey, right? People call it unprecedented.
And that's why we're seeing this unprecedented amount of precipitation.
We've seen nothing like it. It's a freak occurrence.
It rains and storms here often, but never quite like this.
And those are rare, right? They are rare events. But if we continue to talk about them as though they're just freak occurrences versus harbingers of what might come, then I think we fail to really realize the full risk of what we might be facing as a result of climate change. So it gives people a false sense of security. You have a line on a map, and if you're in it, you have to buy insurance. If you're outside of it, you don't have to. And that's not the way really nature works. And FEMA recognizes this too, and that's why they want to move towards different types of maps that aren't so in and out and give a kind of false sense of security and a false sense of understanding of risk.
Can we go back to Houston for just a second? If a lot of Houston is in the 100 or is outside of the 100-year floodplain map, but Houston flooded in 2017, in 2016, and in 2015, is the definition of a 100-year floodplain that you get flooded a couple of times in 100 years, once in 100 years, 3 times in 100 years? If that's the case, it sounds to me like it's not every 100 years. It sounds to me like it's every year. Maybe I'm missing something here.
Well, first of all, it's not. It's sort of misunderstood what a 100-year floodplain means or 500-year floodplain means. It doesn't mean that if you look historically back that you're going to find that this flood occurs on average once every 100 years. It's a designation that means you have a 1% chance in any given year to have a flood at that level or greater. So it's a probability statement. So I do think we have to stop thinking in terms of these 100 and 500-year floods. And in fact, FEMA itself recognizes this. There's a technical map advisory committee that has written some really good stuff about we have to move from these 100 and 500-year flood designations to structure-specific risks. So that would take a lot more information into account. It wouldn't talk just about you're in or out of the floodplain, but what's the probability of this structure given where it is, given the history of how often it's flooded in the past, given its elevation, how it's been built. And that would be a lot more fine-tuned and fine-grained and a lot more useful for communities to understand that type of a risk. So I don't think we should hold our breath and wait for that type of map to occur because that is going to cost a lot of money. Let's face it, that's a big investment. I think it's worth it, but that's an even bigger investment than just updating the maps that we use today, the type of maps that we use today.